Now, Joel, you can correct any of those points if you disagree with it or expand on it, but give us on this May Day basically how the bankers operate, how they work, what you've expanded on from your late uncle, Cleon Skousen, and where we currently are in this dialectic.
My introduction to this whole field was through Cleon's Naked Communist. I remember reading it as a teenager and being shocked at the amount of information about how the government actually facilitated communist governments coming to power. And so my uncle and many others at that time, early on in pre-Goldwater movement, really came to the conclusion the real threat was the communist powers. And everything we were fighting against was against communism, but it wasn't that way. Later on, my uncle found out that it was, in fact, capitalists colluding with communists. He wrote the book, The Naked Capitalist, which was the critique of Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. It suddenly got him a lot of flack because anytime the establishment didn't want Carroll Quigley to write that book. But he did. In fact, they shut down the last edition after he died, wouldn't let his wife republish that. But that's the real story about communism, not only its rise, but the left or the West facilitating that. Went even back before the Communist Revolution. Lenin was kept in relative luxury in Germany by Western powers, paying the bills and keeping him in reserve. When the 1917 revolution in Russia happened, the Kerensky regime came in as, because the Bolsheviks were losing, they came in to produce a coalition government, as they always do, to have a ceasefire so that the West could then systematically deny arms to the White Russian army and feed arms to the Bolsheviks. And that's why the Bolsheviks eventually won.
And by the way, that's all been now released and admitted. And I even saw History Channel where the old CIA section chief admitted our government did indeed put Mao into power and send rifles without the firing pins to Chiang Kai-shek. I mean, it's all on record.
That's right. And then eventually they cut off all arms to Chiang Kai-shek. Now, this was George Catlett Marshall, who was the one who controlled Eisenhower in the Supreme Allied Command. He was the one who directed Eisenhower as a good yes man to Operation Keelhaul, to starve out 2 million German prisoners. A lot of tragedies occurred in World War II. A lot of war crimes occurred in World War II, bombing of civilians purposely to induce Hitler to bomb London. Hitler never would have bombed London had it not been for Churchill deciding we've got to provoke him, and so we're going to firebomb the Ruhr. And that's what triggered Hitler finally to take on. But there's been so much in history that it isn't covered in today's history. Some of the most egregious examples of the globalist and American government fomenting communist revolutions happened in Vietnam. They used to use the model of having a coalition government in Laos, for example, and especially where Laos fell because they forced a coalition government upon the forces that were beating the anti-communists. And then once they had forced them into a coalition government, cut off military supply again, give power to the communists, and then they run through and kill the rest of the people. We had a terrible tragedy happen in Cuba, of course, where we found that the CIA actually gave arms and ammunition to Castro. Then they vilified Batista. They published through Herbert Matthews. They always have a patsy within the CIA-controlled reporter in the New York Times. It used to be Drew Pearson for Washington Post, later on by Jack Anderson, until he kind of repented and tried to get out of the system. That's a different story. But they also did that same model against Anastasio Somoza, one of the most pro-free market, pro-Western people in Nicaragua in Central America, and they crucified that guy. In fact, they finally, after they had given arms to the Sandinistas and allowed them to control Nicaragua, they promised Anastasio Somoza that he'd have a free pass if he'd give up power, set him up in Paraguay, and then allowed them to kill him. So there's a tremendous amount of bad blood among many people in Latin America against the betrayals of the American government. Tried to do the same thing in El Salvador. It more or less didn't work. I was a political advisor down there. Our own State Department people were the ones that were, in fact, trying to stop us. I was a political advisor to the Arena Party, under Roberto D'Abison, and even though he was kind of corrupt and later sold out, the people under him that support him, the so-called oligarchs of Latin America, were in fact true patriots, very, very good, high-class people, really understood what the battle was about. But I remember the ambassador telling me when I was complaining about the evidence and the help that they were giving to the revolutionaries there in El Salvador, and what we were trying to do, I was naive at that time, trying to set up an American-style democracy, an American-style republic, actually, under our constitutional aegis, with the Arena Party. And they said, look, you can have any government in El Salvador you want, but it can't mimic the U.S. Constitution. We don't want it. You can't have it. And sure enough, about a month after that, a big, well-heeled Salvadoran came in with a lot of money. The Arena Party was small before that, was always lacking funding, and he came in with a big load of cash and offered it to them if they'd give him a major position in the party. And from that major position, they ended up eroding the ideological base of the Arena Party, turned it into a mainstream Republican Party, started compromise, won the election, but they never did overturn the socialist direction of the country because of those compromises. So this is the way that the government works. Now, when Cuba happened, what was interesting about the documentation in Cuba is that the ambassador to Cuba was a friend of General Eisenhower, very, very close friend. He was a strong anti-communist, and he got very upset when he found out how Batista was being undermined, when the State Department was cutting off the arms to him in order to make sure that Castro could win. He called Eisenhower on the phone and he said, Dwight, you know, something's not wrong here. We're getting the wrong information out of the State Department. He said, well, go to the State Department, go up to the 4th floor, which was this hotbed of communists, and find out what's going on. So Ambassador Earl Smith comes back to the United States, goes up to the 4th floor of the State Department, and he finds out that the top people who are not communists are protecting the communists in the State Department. He wanted them removed. They refused to do that. He documented it in his book, Knife in the Heart of, I'm trying to think what it, anyway, it was a very, very good book on the entire betrayal of Cuba that happened from our own State Department.
We've got to go to break. Why do the ultra-rich want to put communism in places? I want to explain that dialectic and that synthesis on the other side.
This is the end. Yeah.
DHS to release bacteria in Boston's subway system. You can't make that up. That's breaking at Infowars.com right now. We'll cover that more before the hour ends. Also in the nightly news tonight, FBI arrest anarchists in a Cleveland bomb plot. You see, they have to create the idea of a threat, so they create al-Qaeda, then they fund it, then they protect it. The al-Qaeda groups actually, in some cases, fund real terrorists who really even believe in what they're doing or are just criminals. And it's the same thing with communism. You've got to create the threat, take the liberties in the name of responding to that threat that actually moves you closer to being like what you're trying to fight. You become evil because, well, we've got to break the rules to defeat the evil. And this is part of the more sophisticated system, and it goes back to the Rothschilds and others, where they would just fund all sides in a war. They had European conflicts where there'd be 2 or 3, 4 different factions sometimes, and the big banks would fund it all. And Carroll Quigley, in his book, Bill Clinton's mentor, he was allowed access to the documents where the elite admitted all this. He thought it was a great system. He was proud of it. He wanted to talk about it. And then Joel Skousen's uncle wrote about it, gave it a lot of attention, and here we are today. And I think that's one reason we have a jump on these people at a certain level is because of your uncle and Ron Paul and G. Edward Griffin and countless others who for 30, 40, 50, 60 years have been out there exposing this, and myself now for 17. But only if we point out that we were right and explain the nature of the threat. This is a short segment. We'll continue into the next long segment, but you can keep giving examples of this. And if you're a new listener, folks, go look up everything he's saying. It's all on record now. I mean, I knew this a long time ago, but when I saw on History Channel the CIA section chief, you know, doing an interview from the time in 49, he was very elderly in the interview, and they admitted, oh, yeah, we put Mao in power, like it was funny. Mao killed between 64 and 80+ million people. They debate that. The Chinese say 80+ mil. He says, you know, CIA says 60-something. But, I mean, Joel, again, why? Who are the elites? Why do they want this? What is the larger plan? How do they plan to merge this? What's the end game?
Well, let me first comment on the dialectic itself, because that's where we left off. The dialectics is crucial to their power, because if left to its own devices, history will inexorably drift towards more liberty. People continue to resist tyranny. Most people are good in life. It takes a concerted few to manipulate and keep those people from gaining liberty. The dialectic that is creating a boogeyman, creating a real enemy like China and Russia, allows them to destroy nations from afar with an arm's length transaction. It allows them to get rid of certain countries. It allows them to stop the liberty movement. And as you said, then replace it with a globalist, which is a phony.
They always make revolution against corruption and fascism communist, as if that's the only form of resistance.
That's right. Now, the end game of this, of course, is to eventually get us into a globalist world government. And that's why it took one war, one major war, the First World War, in order to start this international process, the League of Nations. That failed miserably. Tremendous amount of and very intelligent. If you read the arguments against the League of Nations, these people were very well informed at the time. And Wilson even let it out in his dying days that he, in fact, was snookered. And
a lot of people think he was poisoned. He wrote a letter and said, oh, my gosh, the banks have taken over. I've sold out to a foreign power, basically.
Yeah, that's right. World War II got them a lot further. They were talking in their written language about the United Nations 3 years before it was actually created. So you know they were operating under a globalist agenda before that United Nations was put into power. But World War II got them the world government beginnings, but it didn't have any military power. And I believe that that's where the end game is. This next Third World War that they're planning, where Russia and China, that they built up for many, many years, will finally attack the West, is being prepared, it's being planned, and it's being covered up. That is, the threat is being covered up by the powers that be, so that we can finally get people in the depths of a nuclear attack to finally give all power to the government who will... Our leader.
And that's why they give the Panama Canal that we built. Just, y'all here have it. That's why we give the inland ports to the Communist Chinese. What do you make? Because I've confirmed this has been done covertly since Clinton, at least. But now they admit Russian Spetsnaz training to basically seize control of key installations inside the U.S.
Well, this is a suicide philosophy. You've got to remember that the Russians have always been very reluctant to attack the United States. Even with disarmament, the Russians still suspect that we're hiding a lot of weapons, and we are hiding a lot of high-tech weapons. Trouble is, our government doesn't intend to pull those out and use those to protect us. They intend to reserve those till after the attack, so that then they can prosecute this Third World War against Russia and win it for the New World Order, not for American sovereignty.
Stay there. Let's explain this. You can see it. That's why I agree with a lot of what you're breaking down. It's one of the main programs they're following. That everything is an infrastructure for after an attack, and you think we're fascists now. Imagine we lost 150 million Americans, but the new America rose. I mean, it is going to be bad. And I wonder if even talking about it will stop the Russians and others from taking part. We'll be right back. Stay with us. This is key information straight ahead. Joel, I want to get into the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto with you and May Day and what's happening right now, but continue with the larger plan, the factions as you see them, and why you think Russian troops are here being trained.
It's very important that they overcome the natural resistance that the Russians and the Chinese communists have about attacking the United States. They have been fearful. They've been trying to get this war on the road. They thought initially it was going to happen before the year 2000. Here we are almost 12 years later, and it still hasn't happened. The Russians are scared stiff. The Russians also have a lot of internal problems. Part of that is manufactured in order to feign weakness before a strike, but frankly, very little works in the civilian sector. There's too many people who translate that to nothing works in the military sector as well, but that isn't true. The military sector is probably only about 10 points behind the United States in terms of sophistication. What they have, though, is a huge conventional structure of military equipment that once the initial high top end of any military is knocked out by the nuclear war, it's going to be mostly conventional. They got a tremendous advantage in conventional.
So a lot of power when it comes to a long slug out.
That's right. Same thing with the Chinese. They've, of course, got that backup, and they're going to be technologically in another 10 years up on par with the United States. So The problem has been, how did we induce the Russians to get off the stick and finally make this attack on the Russians?
Same thing like the West funding Hitler, Wall Street, the rise of Hitler. That was all a setup. I mean,
that's right.
They really want this. And they want to get it going in the next decade or so before China becomes superior.
Well, that's right, but there's an interplay there. You know, we talked originally about some conservatives coming to the conclusion that the globalists are in bed with the communists. Now, this isn't exactly true. This comes from the Rowan Gaither quote, which was a piece of disinformation that Rowan Gaither, head of the Ford Foundation, gave to the congressional investigating chief who was investigating why they were always funding communism. And he gave them this lame excuse. They're trying to merge the two, so the two societies could merge peacefully. It wasn't true, but it led the Birch Society and others to the false conclusion.
What it is use the threat to sell a police state here to counter it, right?
And to induce, in other words, because the United States and globalists go over there and they play ball, they give them truck factories, they give them technology, it is incorrect to conclude that they're in collusion directly for the same purposes. They're not. They're co-predators.
Well, that's like Hitler. It isn't that Hitler was a British agent, but it's on record they funded him because they wanted the new enemy, so they had an excuse to wreck Europe and take it over.
That's right. In fact, they had to induce Hitler to strike London. He always held out that England would join him in control.
He had that secret peace treaty. That's why he sent Rudolf Hess over to parachute him, going, I have the treaty. Yeah. And they're like, you're locked up in the tower, buddy. And by the way, that's all been released now. They admit that Hitler wouldn't bomb because he thought the Brits were like the supreme Aryans because they hadn't, intermarried or what. I mean, this is what Hitler really said. He wouldn't bomb those populations. He would only bomb military bases. So they went and, like you said, firebomb Berlin and stuff and other areas to try to get him angry to do it.
Firebomb the Ruhr.
The Ruhr. I mean, I'm going from memory. I just remember that whole.
That's right.
And how it was a plan of Churchill to, like, make him get angry.
Exactly. And so this is really criminal activity in the part of the West to induce this. But the end game is the fact that they know that there's this heritage of freedom, there's a heritage of constitutional law, which has been their nemesis for centuries in the United States. The only way to overcome that is to drive it out of people through war, and a war so catastrophic. Too many people keep asking me, as evidence against a conspiracy, why would these people ever destroy their country, which is giving them all the wealth and the power? And
9/11 was a mini beta test. Could they shell and overthrow the Republic off of an attack? Imagine what they can do off of a nuclear war or off of something really big.
A nuclear war is the mother of all terrorist attacks. And it's terrorism not because they're terrorists that are going to do this. It's because our government is going to allow it to happen, knows it's coming, covering for it, covering for all the weapons development. It's interesting, you never see a yearly report from the Pentagon on the Russian threat. Never happens. You do have one, a token report on the Chinese threat. And every single report downplays the threat after they've given...
I was about to say, why are they moving all those bases to the Pacific? Why did the Chinese president 3 months ago say, publicly prepare for war with the U.S., unprecedented?
Yeah. Here's what I think the strategy and how this is going to play out. The Chinese are going to be allied. They are allied right now with Russia to start this war. Russia's going to take the lead. China will basically use some of its nuclear weapons as a backup. Russian nuclear weapons will use for the first strike. They're going to only hit the United States and UK and their nuclear bases. No cities except those where it can't be helped. I'm predicting about 15 U.S. cities are going to go down, be vaporized, but the rest of the nation will survive after some radiation fallout sickness.
Was that what 888 was with Cheney and Georgia trying to go ahead and get the war then? Remember when Cheney, had them roll in, to northern Georgia and the Russians rolled nukes in and that whole fracas in 2008? The whole Georgian conflict, was that an attempt?
Oh, Georgia, you're talking about internationally. That's a little complex. It wasn't a prelude to this. What that was is the globalists know that one of the things that will lead to war is the Russians will begin to use the millions of Russians that they've moved into the former Soviet states and the Baltics, use them as provocation to justify Russian militarism and going in to protect those people. They will create agent provocateurs just like Hitler did in the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig. Create attacks on the Russian people, then justify showing finally the new Russian military force moving in to protect those people. Georgia was one of those provocations that the U.S. handed the Russians so that they could begin that process. There will be others, but that was a first in the preserve the motherland people, which will, and when I've told people in my World Affairs brief that one of the reasons you'll know that war is getting close is when Russia starts to move troops back in to the former Soviet states to protect Russian people. Now, I think the actual trigger for the war will be North Korea attacking South Korea, because that requires that the U.S. use nuclear weapons to stop it. There's no way you can stop North Korea.
And then China has a treaty.
And China has a treaty. And so if the U.S. can be induced to use nuclear weapons to stop a Chinese invasion of South Korea, which is overwhelming, we don't have enough troops. Our troops are being maintained there as cannon fodder so that we can get struck, we can get bloodied.
Pearl Harbored, yeah.
And then, of course, China will then have an excuse to come in and use nuclear weapons in Russia, because we got to stop this first use by the United States of nuclear weapons, stop the bully of the world.
And Russia comes right over beside North Korea. They've got land right there. Let me expand to the south. You know, the whole Red Dawn scenario. I know there's been big inroads by Russia in Mexico and other areas of Latin America. What happens if there is this first strike, a stand down, and then all this takes place? Won't they try to, because I've already seen this through the Ford Foundation, the rest of it, again, handing it to Russia, the Ford Foundation and others, hyping up this La Raza, La Reconquista, Aslan, Southwest, and I hear that from those groups, we're going to come with the commies and just pour right in up and then make that a racial type deal. I mean, how does that add into the constellation?
From what defectors, what information I've got from defectors from the former Soviet Union, they do not intend, neither Russia or China, to occupy initially. They want to use a preemptive nuclear strike to neutralize the United States and England, where the major nuclear powers...
And then start power grabbing other areas.
And then blackmail Europe into submission. They want to take Europe without a fight. Now, the globalists will make sure that they don't let the Europeans capitulate. They will then start a war. So the stage 2 is the Russians and Chinese still not wanting to invade, because it's a long way, you know, it's just suicide to start, just like Hitler, getting too far into Russia. Couldn't sustain that pipeline of military material. Russia and China aren't eager to try to do that. They're going to use surrogates in Latin America to come north to destabilize the United States. What they aren't counting on, of course, is the U.S. is planning to take this nuclear first strike, to then feign completely being down, to drum us into a militarized New World Order. It won't be the United Nations. They'll call it the League of Democracies. They'll exclude all the communist nations, as they should have in the beginning. They purposely let them all into the United Nations because they wanted to create conflict, as we've been talking about. What they aren't anticipating, though, is that the U.S. will bring out all of these high-tech weapons that they're hiding, hand them out to Europe.
Because I've talked to Bob Bowman, and he can only talk about what they've leaked on accident. Star Wars was around in the 70s, and by 79, they had total decapitation systems with DU, meteor gun sabos, you know, robotic, basically satellites up there that have non-nuclear, but it's a meteor gun. It'll kill people a mile under the ground. It'll go right through a mountain. And they've got a lot of these. He said in the 70s, and he's the former head of Star Wars, they already had those up there. So there's undoubtedly a lot of secret technology.
There is. I've got confirmation of that as well. But they will still allow those first strikes to hit, and then they may limit additional strikes, but they want to make sure there's enough destruction in the United States to drive the American people into complete despair, so that they throw down all their barrels and just say to the government...
Well, that's the same model as what 9/11 is. Take the attack, then invade a bunch of countries.
That's right. But this time, the attack is going to be on America. It's going to shock America. We aren't prepared for it. We've never expected America to be attacked. It will happen someday, I can guarantee people. And so, but in the long-term scenario, I think what happens, though, is that we'd never regain our country back in terms of liberty. But there will be bastions and pockets, because one of the things they do lose control of in a nuclear attack is they lose the continuity of government that they're preserving. I mean, it's still there, but it doesn't control all parts of the country.
Yeah, they've got the central systems.
Right. They've got the central system. There's based in Washington, D.C., which is going to be fairly well destroyed.
And Colorado.
They've got Denver as one of the major centers. That's the major control. Now, I suspect that the New World Order is going to move into Denver after... Colorado, or after Washington, D.C.
They pretty much already have. I mean, they visit their prostitutes in D.C.
Yeah. But ultimately, I think for the cause of liberty, it's going to be, and one of the reasons why I believe so much in strategic relocation, there are going to be pockets of resistance. And it's going to be noised about, and rumors will abound of people saying there's liberty here, and there's liberty there, and there's safety here, and people will start to migrate. Our greatest weakness, Alex, is that we're all spread out uniformly around the United States, and we don't have a majority anywhere. The Free State movement tried to change that by moving into either Wyoming or New Hampshire. They chose New Hampshire, unfortunately, which is not in a strategic relocation. But the idea was to move in enough people to have a majority. And that always backfires. It backfired to the Rajneesh that tried to move in and created a haven in Oregon. It backfired for the Mormons trying to move into Missouri and then Illinois. You know, people just say, hey, they're moving in, they're going to outvote us, kick them out. Of course, the Mormons were anti-slavery, and so they got kicked out. The same thing's happened to the Free State people. New Hampshire's building up an movement. Chuck Baldwin's running into the same thing. The powers that be are able to inflame that Chuck Baldwin and these radical constitutional conservatives are coming in to take over Montana. And, to a certain extent, yeah, we want to take over in the name of liberty, but the establishment uses that to gain fear.
I don't think Montanans will be stupid, though. I mean, I think they're not going to buy that.
Well, we can't, it's not there is that old mining, liberal, corrupt mentality in Montana as well. And there is the typical apathetic majority, which can be talked in to demonizing someone as good as Chuck Baldwin. I'm not saying the cause is lost. I'm just saying you have to be very, very careful not to wave the old liberty flag in saying we're going to take over, because it backfires. But I think during war, what's going to happen is we are going to have pockets of liberty. People are going to be driven out of the major cities. There's no job to keep them there.
Well, it's already happening. I mean, I go to the store now, and it's going back to the land, going back to the frontier. Those magazines are everywhere, and people instinctively are buying guns and getting ready and racing to the countryside, even if it's in a haphazard way. That's why Strategic Relocation, available at Infowars.com, 3rd edition, just out, is so important. And the video, just type in Secrets of Survival, Joel Skousen, to watch the hour-and-a-half presentation. It's free online, folks, and very important. And Joel's here, by the way, to tape like a 2-hour special report to really get into it for folks, because this is so important. It'll be out for everybody in a few months here. But Joel, we're about to go to break. We're running out of time here. How will it add to things that we've been here beforehand warning, and that millions of guns, it was 1 million a month and 2 million, 1 month, 4 or 5 million. I mean, people are really, police, military, they all are really starting to wake up.
It helps, Alex, because people are getting preconditioned in their thinking of where safe places are. So that they're not moving, most people aren't moving because they're stuck with their jobs in the big city. But when those are destroyed, when social unrest comes and drives them out, the job is no longer holding them back. Neither is family, neither is climate. They only think, where were those cities that Alex talked about that were safe? And they're going to start to migrate. On foot, on car, by hook and by crook, you're going to find a movement of people consolidating together, and we're going to end up with majorities of liberty-minded people in areas that will be able to resist this new world order that they're putting upon us.
Well, but I mean, what about being able to reverse this if enough people wake up to what's happening? Because I know the globalists are digging in for some type of mega death scenario.
But it has to be reversed in pockets.
What about the globalists just releasing race-specific bioweapons like Cheney talked about? I mean, I agree the scenario you talked about, the evidence is there. That's what the evidence shows. And I know you've got some documents that back a lot of it up, but it seems like they've got other scenarios in the background as well. It's
true, but ultimately we have to depend on God balancing the issue. They could destroy us. They have these weapons and things, but somehow, he doesn't help us an awful lot. We are always fighting against a wall. I think America's destined, because of the sins and the evils of the people, to take some tribulation, a severe, destruction. But out of that, there will be balance, and I think the Lord's going to manage that to keep. He has to, by his own principles, to allow. That's what happens in history over and over again. Final segment with Joel Skousen straight ahead. Important. You've got all these martial law drills, but I don't see it as one big martial law. They're just phasing it in, getting everybody accustomed to a soft martial law, and pretty soon you're in a hard martial law. Do you agree with that statement? Absolutely. This Chicago thing, NATO summit, they're at once fomenting it. They're probably going to move in protesters just so that they can justify.
Then they attack peaceful people instead of them. Yeah.
That's right. Then for the first time, they're going to start moving people out prior to it and say, you're either quarantined here or you leave.
Yeah, they said. At first it started the area right around. Now they're saying more, you got to go.
Yeah, and so they're getting ready to really get people used to having government come in and dictate where you will be, how you will move, and when you will move. It's a very, very bad precedent. But I agree with you. It's not going to mean martial law is imminent across the United States. These are pockets. These are practice martial law. They don't even have enough manpower to do a nationwide martial law. You won't see that till war comes, in my opinion.
Yeah, they're just beta testing. But then you've got like, oh, you can't leave the country if the IRS says so.
Exactly.
Unprecedented tyranny.
But not internationally. We saw that happen in South Africa. When it was clamping down, the ANC took over. Suddenly, don't let the whites leave. Or at least if they want to leave, don't let them take their money. Same thing happened to Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, currency controls. We're starting to see that in terms of tax evasion, tax laws as the excuse for that. But they're aiming on making sure nobody can escape the country to avoid what's coming.
Wow, but then you go to other countries, when all this happens, it's going to be hellish there as well, because all of this is the backdrop of the Agenda 21, where they openly say they want to impoverish everybody.
Yes, a lot of people, unfortunately, think that the nice expat community in Costa Rica is living high on the hog and cheap, and therefore that's the solution. They don't realize that those countries are also controlled by globalists. If they say shut down the Americans, confiscate their bank accounts, it's going to happen overnight, and there are no legal protections, and there's no resistance except the expats there, and they're a tiny minority.
And you lived all over the world.
That's right. I've lived in Latin America in all of these countries, and I can tell you there isn't anywhere in the world where you've got millions capable of resisting.
But see, that's what's sad. I've studied history. I've been in different parts of the world. It's sad to be in a third world despotism with the police or thugs, and to see our system turning into that, it's painful to watch.
And this is a very important change that you mentioned, the transition to thugs. William Grigg Jr. documents every single week. What I have a file, I'm just building a file from his and many others called Bad Cops. And it's just getting epidemic, the amount of ex-military types, shaved heads, overweight, but thuggish in their mentality and just reaping terrible injustices on people. And the judges are backing them up. Normally, you would think you'd take these people, you have them filmed, you have them recorded, you take it to court, they just throw that evidence out. The judges are protecting thuggish behavior. And that's so that there are no penalties, so that you can continue to attract people of that mentality. That's the whole thing about why they hired mercenaries at much greater cost to replace U.S. military. They're building the future thugs that will take down America.
Well said, Joel. Well said. And we're going to do a 2-hour special on all of this. It's so important.